Hello, I'm Robin Visser from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and my talk today is Indigenous Waterways in Taiwanese Sinophone Eco-Literature. Maritime imaginations increasingly inform indigenous speculative and historical fiction, from North America, such as Rebecca Roanhorse's recent novel Black Sun, to Oceania, for example, Syaman Rapongan's Eyes in the Sky from 2012. Following Tongan and Fijian scholar Apeli Hauafo's call to theorize indigenous knowledge of the ocean, a whole school of cultural studies now links Taiwanese indigenous studies to both the Native American transnational frameworks of trans-indigenous belonging and to a contemporary connection with the oceanic frameworks. And in 2016, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen apologized to indigenous peoples for the discrimination they'd endured for centuries. Thus, both in cultural studies and in realpolitik, Taipei celebrates indigeneity. The Taiwanese independence movement also makes it strategic for Taiwan to identify with its Austronesian indigenes, visualizing the island as situated in Oceania archipelago rather than off the coast of China. Further, Taiwan has long been recognized as one of the epicenters of international eco-criticism. An island of 23.85 million, the Republic of China is one of the most ecologically diverse regions on Earth, and its writers engage in island ecology in a context where environmental activism, art, and scholarship are intimately integrated. Most Taiwanese literature, whether written by a Han, Hakka, Haklo, or writer from one of the 16 officially recognized indigenous groups, is Sinophone literature written in Mandarin Chinese, though it often incorporates terms from other languages or dialects. Today, I will be interrogating in this talk the trans-indigenous maritime imagination in contemporary Sinophone eco-literature by both indigenous and Han writers in Taiwan. One aim is to re-examine the ocean-centered imagination proposed by Xinyao Huang as a way to decolonize eco-criticism and re-territorialize trans-indigeneity from a South Seas perspective. She argues, quote, the indigenous bloodlines originating in Taiwan and spreading across the Pacific open up a large world in which indigenous peoples intermingle among numerous interconnecting water routes, unhindered by the boundaries erected by imperial powers, unquote. The fact that trans-indigenous connections predate imperialism was recently scientifically validated by a high-density genome-wide DNA study in 2020, showing that intermingling between indigenes of Polynesia and the Americas had occurred between 1150 and 1380 CE. Yet as Taiwan moved its development regime southward in the 1990s, some scholars also claimed it replicated trajectories of the earlier Empire of Japan, as Taiwan competes with Beijing for markets in Southeast Asia. Eco-critics Zhang and Slovik locate Taiwan in the global south. They say, quote, at once developing and highly advanced, this island illustrates the ironic, multifaceted identities of a society teetering between post-colonial exploitation and first world power, unquote. Recuperating the sea to deterritorialize land-based epistemes of empire has been challenged by scholars who suggest it appropriates indigenous cosmologies and rationalizes neo-imperialist agendas. Thus, while celebrating creative expressions of indigenous waterways in Sinophone ecofiction, this talk will also query the production of trans-indigeneity as a broader project in the Taiwanese imagination. Originally inhabited by Austronesian tribal peoples, Taiwan became a Dutch colony in the 17th century when it saw an influx of migrants from mainland China just 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait. Part of Taiwan later became integrated into the Qing Empire, and it was again occupied by the Japanese from 1895 to 1945. And after the Nationalist Party lost the Civil War to the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, it moved its governance as Republic of China to Taiwan, even as Beijing continues to view Taiwan as one of its provinces. Taiwan's rapid economic growth led to environmental degradation, resulting in landslides, soil and water contamination, deforestation, air pollution, and nuclear waste that disproportionately affected the socially marginalized. The 1980s social movements that ended one-party rule were dominated by issues of the environment, indigenous rights, labor rights, and gender equity. In the political discourse of Taiwanese independence, indigenous peoples, together with the so-called native Taiwanese, or Benshanren, whose ancestors migrated from Taiwan from southern China centuries earlier, are seen to represent the core of genuine Taiwanese-ness, in opposition to so-called mainlanders, or Waishengren, who fled China in 1949. So it's within this context of global neoliberalism, Taiwanese independence, and development in Southeast Asia that Taiwan's eco-critical works began incorporating indigenous themes, to which I now turn. By all accounts, Liu Ka-hsiang is the pioneer of contemporary nature writing in Taiwan. He was initially known as a political poet, including writing 1980s poems on the February 28, 1947 massacre of Benshanren by Waishengren. He was also intensely interested in Taiwan's marine ecology, and especially the birds he observed during his mandatory Navy training. Although he later wrote children's books reorienting the map of Taiwan toward Oceania away from China, he initially relied on influences from classical Chinese literature. Quote, "When I started writing, Taiwan was bereft of experts on the botanical sciences and outdoor fieldwork. I often had to seek material in traditional Chinese literature and history. My sources of inspiration included flora and fauna named in the Book of Odes, images of birds in Tang and Song Dynasty poetry, and even traditional medical texts, such as Li Shizhen's compilation of herbal remedies." Later, Liu became attentive to neglected animals and endangered cetaceans. He wrote many urban ecologies of stray cats and dogs and of beached whales on inland river islands. While his 1990s anthropomorphic novels featured, quote, "suicidal humpback whales" or preyed upon mice, Liu's later animal ecologies orient humans toward an animal perspective in ways that elevate them to equal citizenry within our shared environment, rather than as mere victims of our cruelty, imbuing subalterns with unconventional forms of agency. While few of his works privilege indigenous perspectives on waterways, Liu's focus on marginalized populations inspired another prominent writer, Wang Chia-hsiang, who was a forestry major from Kaohsiung and a chief editor for the Taiwan Times supplement after graduation. Initially lauded as a nature writer, specializing in botany and animal representations, Wang later produced a series of historical fantasies from 1995 to 1999. These imaginative histories meditate on interethnic and species identifications, as well as environmental and colonial relations, in order to inform new futures. In the preface to his 1995 story on Lama Tasin and Dahu Ali, he declares, quote, "Taiwan, like a tribe deprived of its ancestral dreams and totem, has now lost its way. Great literature, great myths, and inspiring totems are what Taiwan really needs," unquote. This fascinating story features Japanese amateur ethnographer Mori Ushinosuke, a historical character who longed to reject his colonial status and fully identified with his research subjects. In the story, Mori is, to quote Christopher Payne, "interstitially situated between the Bunun, the Japanese, and the Han Taiwanese, and Wang Chia-hsiang himself, if we allow for Mori to represent the author's own awareness and hesitancy about futilely trying to, quote-unquote, go native," unquote. Wang is clearly uncomfortable with the deeper implications of Go South identity politics. He hesitates at his historical complicity in both the subjugation of indigenous peoples and his contemporary attempts to identify with them as a type of amends. Wang Chia-hsiang also attempts to navigate neo-colonial subjectivities in his 1997 novel, Daofeng Inland Sea. It recounts how the Dutch East India Company settled on Taiwan from 1625 to 1662, and how, along with Han Chinese pirates and refugees, Dutch traders altered sustainable indigenous ways of farming, fishing, and foraging, deforesting the landscape to create a flat, plain of profitable agricultural crops that radically transform the marshy ecosystem in Taiwan's southwest coast. The novel follows the coming of age of the 17-year-old hero, Sanan, who's initially sailing on a bamboo canoe, spearing fish, but soon witnesses gigantic ships transporting cannons, priests, exotic goods, black slaves, poor Han Chinese workers, and cattle. The novel's particularly good at conveying the sensorium of the male Sarayan hunter. Salty wind on bare flesh while fishing, violent sounds of withered grass devoured by autumn fires set to drive out deer as game, and the smell of rain revitalizing the grass for deer in the spring. In the novel, the Dutch order their Han Chinese conscripts to turn the grassy fields into tillable lands. In historical records by Dutch merchants, they say, quote, Formosa is a very fruitful island, but lays untilled, as its inhabitants are very lazy, unquote, which is a common move made by agrarians to rationalize altering the sustainable landscape of foragers or fishermen. Interestingly, according to environmental economist Jason Moore, it was the sinking of the Netherlands peat bogs in the 16th century that motivated Dutch farmers to venture overseas for other sources of capital. Wang's novel portrays the Sarayans as adaptive agents of such incursions rather than hapless victims. Sanan becomes a plains trader, yet he and his business partner Daloja are continually shocked by the scenes of environmental devastation, such as when they encounter a scene of large-scale clearing of the mangrove forests. Quote, ever since the ancestors landed and settled in the estuaries, swamps, and lakes, at least in Daloja's memory, the forests on both sides of the waterways have always been there silently protecting and guarding them. No one ever imagined these massive water trees would disappear, unquote. So although the indigenous peoples in the novel actively adapt to rapid change, they experience the scale and speed of the devastation as suffocating, evil, and they hear the wind in the bamboo as grieving. Throughout the novel, the dire warning of the female shaman echoes ominously. Quote, the giant tree falls, a great flood comes, we will lose our land to the Han Chinese, unquote. Wang concludes the novel with a historical fact. Quote, in 1822, the Zhenwen River flooded, its riverbank collapsed, half of the Daofeng Inland Sea disappeared, a huge amount of mud and stone destroyed the inland sea, and none of our homes or fisheries at Maotao were spared. So the ending of Daofeng Inland Sea is apocalyptic, as Dutch and Han agrarian imperialism ends millennia-long indigenous livelihoods based on waterways. Despite Wang's respect for the ecological wisdom of the indigenous peoples, their narratives are ultimately those of decline. Unlike genres of Afrofuturism or indigenous speculative futurism, such as novels by Wu Ming-yi, Rebecca Roanhorse, or Sherry Dimeline, where the ravages of the past and present are acknowledged yet lack future determinism, many narratives by non-indigenous writers empathetic to indigenous concerns follow this familiar story arc known in North American literature as Last Indian Laments. Thus, while the indigenous subjectivities in Wang's fiction acknowledge intimate relations with others, in romanticizing Sarayan expressions of the familial, for example, relations between Sarayans and deer, fish, and trees, he replicates imperial logics, like Shi Zijian's and Jiang Rong's nostalgic depictions of the inevitable demise of the Evenki and Mongol ways of life in northeast China. Wang's portrayal of the colonization of the Sarayan people ultimately reifies the indigene akin to the ecological Indian that is destined to perish. Instead, what Wang Chia-hsiang's 1997 novel recounts is indeed an alternative future, but one based on a story that mimics the Southern advanced narrative promoted by the Taiwanese government, where the notion of ocean is taken to signify an open attitude toward cultural interchanges, whereas land denotes an introverted cultural imagination that stresses agrarian rootedness. Shanghai scholar Chen Zihe points out in his analysis of Taiwan's new ocean discourse that this same expansionist globalizing discourse was also promoted by Beijing as early as 1988, exemplified by a television series Heshang River Elegy, which contrasted a, quote, yellow earth civilization to a, quote, blue civilization. He says, quote, "The transformative model of going from a continental culture to a maritime culture is not merely the particular aspiration of the Taiwanese, but rather is related to the establishment of a global capitalist economic system, intensifying competition, control, and reallocation of the ocean." So if Wang's root-seeking eco-literature laments the loss of indigenous waterway livelihoods while seeking to reorient Taiwan southward by reclaiming an ocean imagination, Syaman Rapongan, a Dao indigenous writer from Tao no Pongsu, known as the Island of Human Beings in Tao language, it's known as Lanyu or Orchid Island in Chinese, and it's located 40 kilometers southeast of the island of Taiwan. This writer directly attempts to decolonize the indigenous mind by embracing Oceania island identity. Rapongan left Orchid Island for schooling and work in urban Taiwan, remaining there for decades before moving back to Orchid Island in his 40s with his wife and children to relearn the oceanic way of life of his tribal elders. The Dao people had lived in affluence for centuries, nurtured by a rich Pacific ecosystem and the Kuroshio current. But after the Kuomintang, or the KMT, moved to Taiwan in the 1950s, they set up labor camps and veteran farms and a garrison on Orchid Island. Nonetheless, the Dao preserved their indigenous knowledge through songs, myths, and stories. And when the government established a radioactive waste depository on the island, the Dao shaped political strategy and were active in anti-nuclear protests of the 1980s. Rapongan first achieved acclaim for his 1997 novel, Deep Love for the Cold Sea. In this autobiographical novel, or what Chen Sihe calls a novel in essay form, Rapongan provides intimate vignettes of his experience trying to learn the ways of his elders and eke out a living for his family by spearfishing. In his words, quote, "Losing my job in Taiwan gave me the opportunity to explore my ancestors' love-hate relationship with the sea. This work is dedicated to my dear family and the illiterate elders as a way of expressing their stories," unquote. Qiu Guifeng, a scholar from Taichung, she argues that this in-betweenness of Rapongan and the process of becoming an indigenous person makes it possible for him to stand in for all Taiwanese and the new Taiwanese narrative. The Taiwanese are also reaching out for their matrilineal indigenous roots, unquote. The primary framing conceit of Deep Love for the Cold Sea is how to decolonize one's mind and way of life, and the challenges by the late 20th century are no longer solely externally imposed by the colonizer, but arise from modes of thought internalized within the community itself. Unlike the implicit domestic tensions within celebrated Bunun writer Topus Tamapina's 1987 story, The Last Hunter, which Syaman Rapongan cites in Deep Love, Rapongan is explicit in this novel about domestic stress, as his wife, mother-in-law, and children constantly beg him to make money back in Taiwan. This tension between the modern economic demands and the narrator's desire to connect to indigenous lifeways plays out powerfully in the first vignette of the story. On a stormy winter afternoon, the narrator ventures out on a solo spear diving expedition to the dismay of his elders due to a taboo against returning home after dark. Quote, "I was well aware that as dusk approached, children all went home to eat and sleep, and men still out in the dark could not come home in case the evil spirits followed them to their homes," unquote. Despite his stated desire to learn from his elders, not only does he flaunt their taboo, he ironically engages in an all-too-modern psychoanalytical cogitation once he escapes into the gray ocean, which he calls his deepest love, where, quote, "I felt relaxed, distanced from the quarreling women at home. Am I pursuing a traditional livelihood or merely avoiding modern responsibilities," unquote. So diving into the depths of the stormy ocean synthesizes his tumultuous emotions. Quote, "I looked up at the rain patterns on the surface of the water above, and I knew the sea was alive, has feelings, and is the most gentle partner. Only those that love the sea can appreciate her in her naked beauty," unquote. Despite his fear of the raging storm, after spearing nearly a dozen large fish, he felt a huge sense of accomplishment. quote, "I turned a scene of fear into intimate affection," unquote, which was a metaphor for the domestic challenges he faced at home. And in fact, triumphing over the natural elements and overcoming his fear of the raging sea pales in comparison to his challenges on the home front. His male relatives send a search party to the beach, and at home his mother wails prayers that the evil spirits release his soul and return him to life. His wife is enraged beyond pacifying, yet he continues to fume with resentment. The scene closes with a lengthy ritual in which his male elders engage in a wine-fueled song duel aimed at reconciliation. Quote, "The sacred music of Bofu or Uncle's poem song caused hundreds of my feelings to intertwine. This song was made for me. It was an exhortation. In principle, according to Tao custom, I must reply in kind, but my father responded to his brother on my behalf." And here we see the father's song. There are many songs in this part of the novel. And he says, "I face the sea and wail, brother. I'm ashamed and full of regret. The child's father has caused us to cry over and over again. How do I discipline him, dear brother?" But he ends by saying, the watery expanse we faced was once our partner in heroics. It made us rich with wisdom. We experienced the substance of life. Let us rest, brother. So after his father's song, the narrator reflects that these men have never rebuked me before. They were using words from their inner serenity to enlighten me. I love them deeply, unquote. And then a younger cousin breaks the tension by telling a joke and asking the elders to sing songs of their own fishing exploits in their youth. So the point of this is that the Tao's male social practices provide a space for the narrator to experience his complex emotions with loved ones in a relatively safe space. And eventually he apologizes for causing his family so much anxiety. Contrary to the reader's expectations, however, he's not easily pacified, and throughout the entire event, his resentment resurges again and again, like the ocean waves, activated by female dissatisfaction with his choices. The next morning he ponders, the Tao are a very happy people. They're fortunate to see the sea upon waking. But over the past 40 years, our happiness has been sullied by the evil spirits of materialism, unquote. His wife, this vignette closes with his wife holding their baby daughter and gazing at the sea, commenting, "It's such a bleak day, such a lonely sea," to which he responds, "Yes, it's a very cold feeling." So this unromantic secular understanding of the sea that opens the novel does become mythologized as it proceeds. For example, in one vignette, Rapongan's father tells him flying fish used to jump out of the ocean and land on the reef, allowing the Tao ancestors to learn their diverse kinds. And in this way, the chief of the flying fish, Blackwing, educated our ancestors how to eat flying fish, how to catch them, and how to offer sacrifices to them, unquote. So Rapongan's subsequent novels, which include Black Wings, Memories of the Waves, Eyes of the Sky, and many others, demonstrate his extensive knowledge of the stars and ocean and multi-species world of the Pacific. This knowledge was passed down by his forefathers through storytelling and singing and the physical techniques of fishing, canoeing, and boat building. He underscores the Tao notion that flying fish offer themselves to humans as a seasonal ritual in which predatory fish chase them. Thus, the Tao fishermen only fish during this season. They then switch to coral reef fishing, waiting for the flying fish to return with the north-flowing Kuroshio current, which transports warm tropical water to sustain microbes in coral reefs, thus bringing a variety of marine organisms which migrate in the eddies, unquote. As a corpus, Rapongan's fiction expresses what Apeli Haofu theorized as the way of the ocean. In his two seminal essays, Haofu argues for an Oceania cosmology that centers indigenous practices of creating transnational networks across waterways, as opposed to settler colonial mappings of Pacific Island states and territories as isolated islands. And finally, the production of Oceania trans-indigeneity as a broader project in the Taiwanese imagination pervades novels by award-winning writer Wu Ming-yi, who told me once at a dinner we had at Harvard in 2018 that he believes his father had indigenous heritage but hid it from the family because it was considered shameful in his generation. So in his 2013 novel, The Man with the Compound Eyes, these are some of his selected works. And in his novel, the first major novel, The Man with the Compound Eyes, 3 Pacific islands provide the setting. The island symbolizes Taiwan, Waio symbolizes Taiwan's Austronesian indigenous roots, and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch symbolizes present remnants of our past. The story also traverses Norwegian whaling ships, German universities, Brazilian beaches, the Gulf Coast in the US, and Danish campgrounds, and it's rife with incessantly torrential rains, floods, typhoons, landslides, earthquakes, soil erosions, and mountain tunnel cave-ins. So despite its apocalyptic tone, the indigenous practices in the novel, the indigenous practices of relationality in the novel, in the town of Haven, offer hope and healing to characters in the novel. Such indigenous forms of care and reciprocity also operate in the real world within quantum field theory, according to physicist and cultural theorist Karen Barad. In a recent lecture, she cited the powerful poem video Anointed by Indigenous Marshall Islands poet Kathy Jetnell Kidgener. This artwork denounces epistemologies of radioactive racism, premised on notions of Pacific Islands as empty of life, grounds for the U.S. military to conduct 67 nuclear test explosions during the Cold War. Like Haofu, who argues that colonial mappings of the void must be replaced by an archipelago imagination of Oceania, rife with mobility, agency, and connection, Barad denounces colonial epistemes based on Newtonian physics of the void that rationalize scientific applications of quantum field theory as quote-unquote politically neutral. The mythological logic of the void, as opposed to material agency of the cosmos, is what Wu Ming-yi highlights in his novel, The Man with the Compound Eyes. The novel ends with an underwater nuclear test, which creates an earthquake, activating a tsunami wave that sends a piece of the trash vortex hurling toward Waio. Quote, in 3 minutes and 32 seconds, it would, like a gigantic carpenter's plane, peel away everything on the island, the living and the non-living, into the sea, unquote. So Wu Ming-yi is not writing magical realism so much as hyperrealism. He's not lamenting the inevitable end of indigeneity so much as making its violent eradications visible. Ultimately, the novel resonates with Barad's understanding of indigenous care within matter. She explains, quote, the void is far from empty. It's flush with yearning and possibilities. It can hardly be thought of as that which does not matter. It's a womb that births existence. Matter is continually inseparable from the void. Even the smallest bits of matter are an enormous multitude making up material relations, sedimented histories of interactions with itself and all others across time and space. In this sense, indigenous waterways in Taiwanese Sinophone literature depict matter. Ultimately, these sedimented histories of interactions with itself and all others across time and space are what Taiwanese writers like Wu Ming-yi are trying to unearth and make visible in their writings of indigenous waterways situated within fraught contexts of inner imperiality. Thank you.